Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Research Impact Beyond Academia, Utilizing Policy Citations and Researcher Librarian Partnerships, which is sponsored by Overton. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. I'll just put a couple links in the chat where you can register for upcoming webinars and watch previous webinar recordings. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to submit any questions or comments for our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions you'd like or would like to be addressed. Also, there's closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom panel of your screen. Last, please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version and where to access today's slides. And with that, we are ready to get started, so I will hand it over to Ewan.
Thanks, Sabrina, and hi everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Ewan Addy, and I work for Overton. As Sabrina said, we help pull this webinar together with, we're quite a new company, and over the past 4 or 5 years, we've learned a lot from a lot of the people we've worked with, or either as customers or collaborators, and some of them are here today. We've already learned a lot from them, so hopefully you will too. Why we pick policy citations often focuses on helping universities and academics, measure and get a feel for their social impact, and especially their impact on policy. Interestingly, if you ask researchers why they became scientists, so there's an interesting study back in 2009 from the Pew Research Center that they repeat in 2015. If you say, why did scientists choose their careers? Well, the first one is actually intellectual curiosity and solving challenging problem. But the second one is to work for the public good. So researchers do, feel like part of why they became scientists is to help, cure cancer or to solve climate change or to do, tackle any number of big problems and small. And part of that is, helping to shape policy and legislation and guidelines. So how, change how the world works, the policy citations and policy impact. And you can see that this is a slightly different study from the conversation, but when you ask, or when you investigate, what are the communication goals that individual researchers have, right up there at the top tends to be, ensuring policymakers use scientific evidence, get the best possible evidence they can to help make the decisions they make. And despite a lot of what's happening in the world, today and some of the heat and noise around it, governments and policymakers do still want that too, as does the general public. They want the best evidence possible to be underpinning their political decisions. And it gets used a lot. Academic evidence is used all the time in policy, both state level, national level, and globally. There's a lot of literature on this nowadays using Overton data and other data sets. We've worked on some reports with people, including most recently with Springer Nature. There's a report coming out next month talking about policy related to the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. So they're kind of big global goals, and the policy that helps answer those goals, how much of it uses academic research and where is it from? And a lot of it is actually from US institutions, especially just because of the US's place in the kind of big research producing countries of the world. So researchers want it, but they don't often feel equipped to actually pull the data together or to understand the impact they're having or how best to create impact in the first place. And that's where tools like Overton come in, or where we feel we can add some value. to work with librarians and policy officers and other professional staff to help equip researchers with those tools that they need. So we make an app called Overton Index. We've also collaborated with others, including Sage, on tools like Sage Policy Profiles. So both of these are places where you can go, and either at a university level for Overton or a single researcher level for Sage Policy Profiles, you can go and you can quickly get back a feel for, has the work that a researcher has done kind of got a footprint somewhere in policy. So I encourage you, please do feel free to check out those tools after the talk. But with that, I'm going to finish and hand over to people who actually know what they're talking about when it comes to helping researchers with this stuff. So I think I'm going to pass to David.
Thank you, Ewan. So my name is David Flynn. I'm a senior research librarian at Boston University's Alumni Medical Library, and I'm also an assistant professor in our School of Medicine. So every other speaker, I believe, after me is going to be talking about the use of Overton as kind of an analytics or bibliometrics tool. And to be honest, that's how most of our users at BU use Overton as well. It's a fantastic tool for that, sort of finding the impact and reach of your scholars. But my job primarily as a research librarian is helping people do things like systematic and scoping reviews. And I'm always looking for sources of great literature, and Overton's a great tool for great literature as well. So do you need great literature in your job? So I would say, certainly in my case as a medical librarian, we support our medical school, our dental school, our School of Public Health, and our Division of Graduate Medical Sciences. We're also the library of record for Boston Medical Center, kind of the hospital associated with their medical school. We also work with our Center for Translational Research. And just in the last couple of years, we've also worked with our law school, engineers, and people from computer science. So there were a lot of people on our campus and probably on your campus who work in the intersection of science and society, and that's where great literature comes in handy. Okay, so using Overton as kind of a discovery tool for great literature is great. It supports fairly complex keyword searches, and I'll show you an example in a second. You can search in various ways. I usually like to search with index terms or keywords if I'm working on a systematic or scoping review. You can export the results in a variety of formats. Again, from my sort of use case with a systematic review or scoping review, it's usually CSV or RIS, so people can pop those citations into like Mendeley or Zotero or something and actually screen the documents that we found. So here's an example search that I did. This is actually the very first search I did using Overton as a discovery tool. This was a couple of years ago. There's a group from our engineering school. There's a department called the Center on Forced Displacement. And one of their postdocs is working on this project right now about kind of the water quality in refugee camps. And this was the search. She was trying to find specific literature about this question and these countries. So the first thing I did was here, back up for a second. Sorry about that. So when you're looking at Overton, the interface, there is this explore the data sort of drop down at the top of the screen. And when you click on that, it shows you exactly, this is kind of a back door into the different sorts of ways you can look at the data that Overton actually uses. And the first thing I did was click where it says view all of Overton's policy sources. And now you can actually see some information about the information that Overton collects. And you see there's about 21.3 million documents right now. We at BU started using Overton, I think in 2020 or 2021, we're a pretty early adapter. And then about 6 million documents there. So Overton, really, when they say they're always adding new sources, they really are. That's true. They're adding things all the time, which is great. This interface gives you some control over what you want to see as well. As you can see, you can sort by region, countries, sort of the type of organization. It gives you a lot of control if you want to narrow it down, say just to the United States, or those countries I showed, like just Uganda, whatever makes sense for your search. And also, again, it shows you the scope of Overton. And the nice thing is, I didn't highlight it, unfortunately, but off to the upper right-hand side, it says suggest a new source. So if there's a valuable source of great literature you use all the time, suggest that to Overton too, and they can try to add that to sort of their holdings as well. Okay, but really back to my question. So once I saw that Overton was probably have some interesting results that came back, I clicked on this browse all topics. So as someone who does a lot of systematic and scoping reviews, I like to be as precise as possible. So I like to do a search with sort of the index terms that that database or resource uses to kind of make my search as relevant as possible. So when you click on browse all topics, you do see this kind of topic map. So broadly, I figured that infectious diseases, that was the question, probably fell into this kind of health bucket right here. So if you click on explore more at the bottom, the bucket is highlighted here. It does show you kind of the overview of the terms that come back. So I did see infectious diseases here as a topic, which makes sense. And when you click on that, it's just going to show you kind of unsurprisingly, so these are all the documents under that topic. So under this infectious diseases, which of course is very big. It's, I think, 285,000, but obviously you can refine that. If you prefer to search with keywords, and sometimes I do that too, just depending on the question, the keyword, of course, when you click on a document that comes back with that particular search, you will see that topic map, that index term here as well. So I can click on infectious diseases here. Either way, it's going to get me back to that total list of all the infectious disease documents. But of course, that's too broad for my specific question. So I took the exact question from these researchers and I popped this verbatim into Overton. And it could handle, like I said, a fairly complex Overton search, a Boolean search, did a pretty good job of handling it. And this brought back about 14,000 results. And again, that's probably too big. But as you can see off to the left-hand side of the screen of that little kind of pink heading, there is a set of filters you can use in Overton too, which are really useful. And then with the filters here, that the most obvious ones are like source, document type, source country, those obviously make sense. But I will say the added or published after filter is great if there's like a landmark date. So say you wanted to know, how did American sort of healthcare policy change after Obamacare was enacted? I think it took place January 1st, 2014. You could put that date into the after filter and see the papers that how policy changed after that landmark event. But for this search, I just filtered by source. And again, here's just a kind of a close-up of that search, the filter view. So when you're looking at this by source, it shows you the organizations where the most results come back and the number. So it's great that you can just go through here and maybe just look at the really high yield targets, maybe just the UN or the WHO, whatever makes sense. Again, originally when I was working with this group as researchers, I would just go, say I'd click on the one for World Health Organization and limit just to that, and then export that as CSV for them, so they can then go through and look at those in their own time and screen. At the time, only a handful of people, I think 5 people at BU, really sort of analytics people, had access to Overton. I was lucky to be one of them. So I would just kind of send people the results that I downloaded, but now everybody at our campus has access to these searches themselves. The nice thing too about Overton, it's a discovery tool, lends itself to secondary discovery too. So from this list, I saw that WHO was number 2 with like 1,900 results. I can now use that to do a different search in a different way, but still using the information I learned from Overton. So I just did a targeted Google search just for the WHO. And of course, the way you do that, just go to the tools, advanced search, and you pop WHO into the domain for that particular search. And now it's only going to search WHO for that topic. And it brings back plenty of results. Similarly, you can also search Google just by a specific country. So I knew that from Overton, there was about 500 some odd documents from Uganda. Same search, you just put .ug, the country code, into Google to get just Uganda. And the nice thing about this in terms of discovery, you start to see some of the secondary subdomains that come back. So I can see, for example, it's like health.go.ug. So now I know that that is the Ministry of Health. So I can do another Google search just based on that information. So as great as Overton is at helping you find things like sort of primary sources through it, that's also a great way for secondary searches using what you learned from Overton. So that's everything I was going to say about using it as a case. And I believe that Rachel, you're up next talking about your uses at Virginia Tech.
Great, thank you, David. And here we go. All right, so I'm Rachel Miles, and I work in research impact and with research information management systems. And so I'm doing a lot of work with bibliographic databases, citation data, and then I also try to work with data from altmetric and Overton to show impact beyond academia. And then I'll turn it over to Isabel, my colleague at Virginia Tech, as well after we get into her. So first I want to give an introduction to our kind of presentation. I'll turn it over to Isabel and then she'll turn it back over to me. So we're basically looking at 2 different cases. They have a lot of similarities. Isabel's looking at how research is cited in a very specific disciplinary group, and she'll explain that more in depth to you. And I'm looking at the policy citations to research articles from a college at Virginia Tech. And I'm keeping that college anonymous since I didn't get permission from their dean in time before this webinar, and they're kind of hard to reach anyway, so I just said I would keep it anonymous for now. So we kind of want to go back to the why of why we want to, use policy citations to research. And I've already said that they offer a fuller picture of knowledge dissemination and influence. They can also indicate potential public policy or societal impact. So oftentimes they're cited in public policy documents, but those documents don't actually mean that there's a policy change taking place. And so, but there is some research that shows the policy documents, those citations do actually a lot of times lead to policy impact. There's sort of trajectory there. It can also show how research gets translated into usable public knowledge. So it's also that gray literature part that David was talking about, and reveals which disciplines are more policy relevant than others, which is an interesting story to look at as well. And then researchers can then better frame and disseminate their findings for policy uptake. So if they see it's being there's uptake in a certain policy organization, they can then perhaps communicate with them and reach out to them. It also helps justify research investment. So universities can use this information to justify their goals and strategies for their research trajectories and their research goals. So this has kind of already been covered, but Overton kind of has these two different purposes. It's looking at the research that's cited in policy documents as well as other policy documents, citing other policy documents, and then it also is the searchable index for gray literature. So when we're looking at getting policy citation reports in Overton, there's kind of this general process we follow where we're looking at gathering researcher identifiers. We typically use Scopus since it tends to have more accurate and more consistent identifiers for researchers. And then we take those identifiers and match them to the DOIs of their articles in the database. Then we export that list and we copy paste all the DOIs and we paste them into Overton. And then we generate reports from Overton, and we take the CSV data that they have generated, and we can then create our own reports and analytics from there. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Isabel, and then she'll turn it back over to me.
Great, thanks, Rachel. I'm not a librarian. I'm actually a social scientist, and I work with social science faculty, trying to help them write grants and otherwise nurture their professional development. And as part of that, I run a policy group. And so we were interested, we've been around for about 6 years, and we were interested whether this tool might help us look at impacts or characterize in some of our publications. So we undertook having trouble, it's advancing, but there we go. We undertook a study, and just to tell you a little bit about our group, so we're not a formal college or anything like that. We draw from researchers across the campus, and in fact, our mission is really to raise visibility of policy-related habits of mind or thinking for people in a range of disciplines who might not normally think about this. And I've just listed a few of our signature strategies, but you can get the slides, and there's our website if you want to look more into that. But basically, we had a couple of questions, including how reliable and valid the Overton database was for our purposes, how easy it was to use, how useful and informative were current categories that Overton had come up with, and then just general summaries, thinking into the future, would we want to continue using this, what the strengths and weaknesses of it. So we operationalize our impact, restricting it to the years of our groups coming into being, 2017, and then we want completed years. We did this in summer of 2024, so through 2023. And it became very clear early on that we really had to think about multiple strategies about how to think about impact. So we came up with 3 main ways to do this. First is just like you may hear from Rachel, we looked at aggregate counts. Once we collected all the articles, we weeded out people who weren't part of tech and so forth. We did some cleaning. what did it tell us? What kind of story did it tell us about the group? But then we were also interested about individual researchers. We were interested in whether this could maybe help people make a case to their department heads or so forth that they were having a reach beyond academic audiences. And third, we were interested in whether there were groups of people who worked together productively, if we could sort of capture that a little bit. So three things that we looked at. In terms of the aggregate, we found that the provenance of our policy documents was mostly government, which my understanding is that is the bulk of the Overton documents that made sense, think tank, IGOs, and others. We also had a nice range across the world, not surprisingly biggest in North America and Europe, but we have faculty who do work across the whole world. So that was nice to see that represented. And we took a look at the categories. This is raw numbers, but that first one, health, I think is about 49% of the documents that we found, followed if you kind of concatenate categories by environmental sustainability kind of considerations. And perhaps not a big surprise considering that our years overlapped with the COVID pandemic. I will say that it took a lot more time to get to individual researchers because we were using DOIs, so article-based, which of course usually have more than one author. And we had to basically do a lot of manual cleaning and rearranging to get to individuals. But this is essentially what we found out, that our modal document for our members was 0. But we had a lot who were cited a lot, including one who was 206 citations. Again, that was COVID related, so it may not look the same. But that was an interesting kind of look, as well as we could identify who were the most productive, what kind of departments were the most productive in the Overton database. Now, acknowledging that, of course, this doesn't capture everything. So third, we looked at patterns or partnerships, and I want to just thank Rachel and her team at the library for helping us throughout this whole project, but with this in particular, as well as Anissa Adolph from Overton to help guide us with our strategy. But these were our methods. We basically brought in Viz network package, our studio, and tried to calculate sort of a weight of collaboration. So we were able to come up with some interesting graphics. So this is the little sphere, is really looks like sort of a dandelion, is really the entire network. And then taking one of them out just to look at and see who specifically was the key player. And it doesn't mean that everyone in this network was a Virginia Tech Plus policy member, but that main person should be. So it's a sort of, we're thinking this might be a tool to help us grow our network as well. So to summarize, we found that mostly Overton was accurate in what they reported. We, of course, don't know what was omitted. While we encountered some inconsistencies, the proportion was small relative to the accurate classification. Some of our biggest challenges were publications that met our time frame, but the person wasn't yet at Virginia Tech or had left Virginia Tech. And so we had to manually clean out that to get a more precise estimate. And we were happy to see the kinds of documents and the range across the world, really. We also really appreciated the detail about the policy documents that were provided. We did a couple case studies. We sent things to faculty, and they were very tickled to see some of this. And then Overton itself provided some technical detail about ways that they do quality assurance. We, of course, did find limitations as well. I think one of the biggest things, at least a year ago, we weren't really completely clear if conference proceedings were captured. It seemed like congressional hearings were not systematically included, although we're getting better over time. We could see that in the annual increases. And details linking policy document. There were some space limitations. We were doing a large group for many years. I think if you did a smaller group for 1 year, you wouldn't run into these same kind of data limitations. And then finally, linking to individual researchers as opposed to a group, but a batch of individual researchers was the most time consuming and challenging. So in conclusion, we are looking forward to continuing to use Overton. We found the reliability and validity excellent to acceptable. We've got better at using it, and we think the coding categories are sort of mixed, but we can easily come up with our own that will be relevant to our folks. So I think that's it for me. I'll pass this over to Rachel.
Great, thank you, Isabel. And now I'm going to talk about the use case for an academic college using Overton data. So I got a request from a college to provide citation impact reporting over the past 10 years, and I've had requests from them every 2 to 3 years over the past 6 years. So I was used to working with this college. I've also provided them altmetric report from Altmetric Explorer. And so for the 2023 request, which so 2 years ago, I also provided the Overton data and a dashboard to them. I use a variety of sources for reporting on this data. So SciVal, Scopus, Web of Science, and Elements, our RIM system, to export and analyze all the citation data. My normal process, as I mentioned before, is to use Scopus for gathering the Scopus author identifiers and the advanced search in Scopus to retrieve all the papers by those authors. Instead, I was using Elements to get all this data, since I used Elements for exporting a lot of the different types of outputs that the college was producing, since it has more diverse data in it. Interestingly, though, I think Scopus, I did a search in Scopus with their Scopus IDs and found there was a couple hundred more DOIs than what we pulled out of Elements, which just kind of shows that you're not necessarily getting everything out of a RIM system, because it is kind of an opt-in system. So that's the search parameter for 10 years, 2014 to 2023. There were over 7,000 works out of Elements, and of those, around 2,500 had DOIs. I then copied those DOIs and then pasted them into Overton. So interestingly, I ran the same search again before this webinar, and Overton has drastically increased the number of policy documents in their database. And so if you look at the numbers here, obviously the number of outputs with DOIs is the same at the very bottom there. And the number of outputs with policy citations increased almost twofold, in the same with the number of policy citations. So basically looking at the 2025 data, there were 634 outputs out of the 2,500 that did have policy citations, and the number of those policy citations was over 2,000. So there's multiple, citations to the same documents, essentially is what that's showing. So what's next when I have this data is that I go and generate a report in Overton. Then there's many different various things you can copy from that report in CSV formats. And then I had lots of sheets within a spreadsheet. Then I imported that spreadsheet into Tableau to create my own visuals. Once you get the slides, which I think that they'll share with you, there's a link to the dashboard here that you can go to see those different visualizations. So an example of one of these, similar to what Isabel was showing, is that we have a lot of diversity across the world where these policy documents are coming from. And not surprisingly, most of them are coming from the US, although this does have to do with the availability of policy documents to track online. And so that's also a reason why you see that, especially in the global north and developed countries. I also looked at the source of the policy documents. So, You can scroll down on this Tableau dashboard to see all the sources, but this kind of helps the administrators, such as the dean, kind of show to stakeholders where the research is making impact in different organizations. So that's kind of an interesting way to show this impact. Also looked at the source sector and the organization type. So not surprisingly, most of them are coming from government, because governments tend to produce the most policy documents, especially online. But this is still interesting to see this kind of data. This was also kind of interesting because we're also looking at the institutions that also cite these policy documents. I did mention to the administrators that they could use this to look for, potential collaborators within these other institutions. But they didn't reach out to me to get more data on like the researchers that were actually contributing to these citations. They might have already been collaborating, so that could be a reason why as well. But I think that this is kind of, this would be interesting to explore more, so to see how the researchers are already collaborating based on this data as well, to see how it compares. I then created a interactive word cloud within Tableau, but it wasn't super helpful because it's very jumbled and it's very detailed. You could actually hover over the different topics and then see how many times they were cited in policy documents, or assigned to the policy documents that they were citing the research. So I decided to also switch to a bibliometric visualization tool, VosViewer, which some of you might be familiar with. It's a very popular tool. I took the titles of the citing policy documents and copied them into Google Sheets first, because there was 305 non-English titles out of 2,200 that in 39 different languages. So I wanted to translate those titles first, and it's really easy to do that in Google Sheets. Then copy pasted all those titles into the Scopus heading of the title column. So it would be easy using that kind of a spreadsheet CSV file to upload into VosViewer. I also took the topics from Overton data and copied them into the index keyword column for a Scopus spreadsheet, then uploaded that spreadsheet to VosViewer for what's called term co-occurrence visualizations. So two different ones. So the first one is looking at the topics, and so you could zoom into these, and I've linked to the actual map, which is interactive, and you can zoom into these, you can select them and see how many times they've been cited or used in the policy documents. You could also see how they're connected to one another. That means they're being assigned to the same documents multiple times within the data set. Also did a title term co-occurrence map. So it basically text mined the titles and assigned different terms or phrases that you could then, explore more. I did get rid of the irrelevant terms when I was creating this visualization as well. So how is this data used? So this is from the college associate dean, is that the dean integrated some of the findings into discussions about the college internally and with stakeholders. So it was a nice way to let folks know about the local, national, and international impacts on policy. So beyond that, I don't know exactly how they used it, but that was the only quote I got from them. So then I also, in preparing for this webinar, I wanted to see how finding policy documents that mention the college. So rather than just looking at citations to the research from the college, I wanted to see how often the college and its departments were mentioned across policy documents. So like acknowledgements and things like that. I did a advanced search using a Boolean operators and so forth to look at all the different ways that departments could be, spelled out and the college spelled out and so on. So 61 results for that time period. Well, I'm sorry, for all time from 2010 to 25, there appeared to be, and they were all unique policy documents. So this could enhance the impact report, even though it's a small collection of documents that are mentioning the college. But I could probably improve the search string to return more documents about it, because I didn't use the centers in the search and I was just kind of experimenting with this. Overton also, this is kind of a feature request to Overton, and maybe I'll put this as a formal feature request for those of you from Overton. It includes this match snippet in the match references sheet of the export. However, most of these snippets are to the reference, which makes sense because they're trying to capture that reference, and that's how they're exporting and this data. But it would be really helpful to have the in-text citation instead. We could do some more meaningful analytics with this data possibly to see how the research is getting cited, which would be really cool to see that because bibliographic databases don't do that either. So these snippets are related to the searches and mentions to the college in the documents. Most of them are just acknowledgements, so they don't necessarily have a lot of meaning beyond that, but it's still important for demonstrating impact and would show some more insight with some text mining as well. So that's all we have from our presentation, and I will turn this over.
Hi, I'm Yvonne from the University of Cambridge. I run the physical science libraries here, but I work very closely with a team of librarians across Cambridge. We're slightly unusual in our setup. Cambridge has over 120 libraries, which means that we're in a fairly unique position. We probably employ more librarians than anyone, maybe bar Oxford in the UK. And we've been using Overton now. I was trying to look up actually when we took up the subscription. So we've been using it for 18 months. And without exception, the feedback we've had has been absolutely positive. To the extent that people have come, we've put on training and people have come to the training sessions and said, oh, it's really self-evident. We didn't actually need to do any of the training, which is both gratifying and not, but it's increasingly a tool that we're telling our researchers to use, both for resource discovery and for analytics. I have a particular interest in grey literature. In a previous existence as publisher, I worked on something called UCOP, which was UK government official publications. And what was so interesting was that it's very, very difficult to find grey literature. And obviously, one of the reasons that UK academia is funded as it is that people want to see societal impact from research. And yes, you can produce papers, etc. But actually, at the end of the day, people do want to know that, what they're doing, and it's much as Ian said, does have an impact on society as a whole. So the UK context, and I'm not sure how different this is from the US context, is that once every few years, we have something called the Research Excellence Exercise. And this is our system for assessing the quality of research in UK higher education institutions. And it's undertaken by our 4 UK higher education funding bodies. So in England, we have Research England, excuse me, the Scottish Funding Council, the Higher Education Funding Council for Wales, and the Department for the Economy in Northern Ireland. And among the data that is submitted by universities and other institutions are case studies that really describe the impact of the research. That is, where they've made a difference to society, health, or, for example, the economy. And that's a material that people find really difficult to collate. So we have another REV coming up in 2029. And I think Overton will probably be one of the key tools that we use alongside our colleagues in the research office. So because we have this disparate library system in Cambridge, sometimes librarians are asked to be involved with producing these case studies, the impact studies, and sometimes it's our research office. To give you an idea of the scale, for the last REF, which was 2022, Cambridge returned 2,982 academic and research staff to this particular exercise. And that included a lot of early career researchers as well. And apparently we did very well. And it's something like, 93% of our research was rated world leading or internationally excellent. So we're very good at producing the research, but I think we're not quite so good at telling people about the impact of the research. So Overton is going to be incredibly useful when we come to the next research excellence framework. And the reason it's so important is that the research excellence framework is how the government decides the higher education funding bodies allocate us funding for research. So if an institution doesn't get an excellent for a particular subject area, it's quite probable that internal politics aside, there will be huge pressure put on that department. And in the past, some departments, because they didn't get this ref, you know, the standard that it was expected, departments have been faced with closure. So it's really, really important for us that, you know, we get the stories out. So I was looking earlier at the University of Cambridge and at the number of documents referring to our researchers in the last few years since Overton started. And at the moment, the document count is about 76,000 documents. And what's particularly interesting for us when we look at them is it picks up on a lot of interdisciplinary research. So if our researchers are writing for a particular academic journal, so you're writing in high energy physics, you know where you're going to go to find material about high energy physics. But if you've got a physicist writing a policy paper, it's very important that we can also track that sort of information. So the next ref, which is the next of these funding cycles, we've been told that impact case studies that are going to be written are going to amount to 25% of the overall assessment score, which is really quite, you know, a difficult thing to actually manage, to say that, you know, some of our researchers, especially some of my researchers that I work very closely with here in mathematics, they're working on what I think could be described as quite obscure areas of mathematics. And yet, you know, the impact from it may not be straightforward, but actually if I use Overton as a tool, I find that actually quite a few of our academics may not, they may have published papers in the maths journals, but for example, in the COVID pandemic, these were people doing modeling for the government on COVID rates. The leading paper, it's not a paper, but the leading research and policy on bicycle helmets has been undertaken by somebody within the maths faculty here. But that's not the sort of thing you're ever going to find looking through the scientific literature. So it's really relevant research, but it's very difficult for the academics to take ownership of it. The other way we use ref, as opposed, is also for individual academics within the departments when people are looking for tenure. We're very cautious. I think everybody probably knows about DORA, you know, San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment. We're very keen that our researchers are able to research without feeling that they have to publish in certain very high impact journals. But there's the theory of that and the practicality of that, because of course our researchers are working across an international playing field where not everybody, you know, feels the same. So we're very keen at using other tools to show how important the research that is being undertaken is. So for that we use tools like altmetrics alongside, you know, the citation databases, and increasingly Scopus. We use Scopus, Web of Science, but increasingly we've also been using Overton to feed into that as well. So when people are going up for tenure or going up for promotion, they can say, well, yes, I have these papers, but look at the actual impact on society that my research is having. And I spoke to all my colleagues across Cambridge and asked them if they could give us any, you know, give me any Overton use cases. And it's actually been really interesting. So the business school, it's been very heavily used by policy related research groups to actually search for grey literature. So this is the other aspect of Overton. We found it's a very, very powerful search engine for grey literature. It's a great discovery tool. We've also found in my clinical colleagues, people in the medical library, the researchers use it for systematic reviews on public health topics, especially when it's relevant to include, it's useful to include relevant reports from government, a non-governmental organization. as this form of literature is not well represented on standard bibliographic databases. And my colleague actually wrote and said, before we had access to Overton, searching for this material was a laborious and time-consuming process that either involved manually combing through individual government websites or doing multiple repeated Google advanced searches, limiting the search to specific individual government, non-governmental organization websites. We now recommend it as a starting point in response to inquiries from researchers wanting to include reports in their research. So it has, been a very, very powerful tool. And PhD students we know are using it at the moment, in particular, because we can see our stats, in researching public health topics. One of my colleagues who works in the geography library, again, was trying to find out about a particular competition, the Entente Cordiale Challenge. And their research focus was interdisciplinary. And again, we found that Overton gave really, really good results, which they would not have been able to find out all the information they needed otherwise. So that's sort of a whistle-stop tour about how we've been using it and how, our use of stats with fairly limited promotion have been really, really good. So we're very happy that we took out the subscription. And the thing that I've been doing over the last few days, actually, it was one of my we have a centre here for existential risk, which is looking at catastrophic things that could happen, but it's completely interdisciplinary. And one of my colleagues who is a physicist was saying, well, I can go into the normal databases to find out what my research, where it's cited. I dread to use the word H-index, but I can find out where my physics research is cited. But I've spent several years now working in this interdisciplinary centre. Where do I go to find out that sort of information? And what we've been saying to them is, well, actually, you just look in Overton. And I did a search for him earlier in the week for that reason. So that I appreciate. I'm probably just about close to my time. So that's how we've been using it in Cambridge. So I think I don't know who I hand over to now.
You can hand over to
Sabrina.
me.
I thought it was you, Sabrina, but I was just wondering if there is. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much, Siobhan and Rachel, Isabel, David, Ewan. We have a little over 10 minutes for questions. So I'll encourage our attendees, if you haven't submitted a question or if you haven't voted on a question, feel free to do so. And we will just jump right into the questions. Okay, looks like the most popular question right now is from Jacintha, who says, is there evidence or research that quantitatively demonstrates the link between policy citations and broader public policy or societal impact? And I'll just throw this to the group, maybe Ewan, if you'd like to start.
So I can, it's a really good question. It's a very complicated question, so I'll try and think. But maybe I'll answer the beginning of it. And actually, I think it ties in with some stuff that probably Rachel's more of an expert on. But I mean, so the short answer is yes, there is some research that looks at this, and including from us directly. We have a paper in QSS journal about Overton and trying to correlate researchers in the UK. Yvonne mentioned REF and how we kind of track policy impact. And so we tried to correlate researchers' self-reported policy impact with the number of citations that they got to a project. And it's for lots of reasons that are fairly apparent, at least that policy citations are not the be-all and end-all of academic policy interaction. The correlations, medium to pretty good in some cases, like in medicine and economics, and it's not so great in others, especially in arts and humanities. But so that's kind of the short answer. And the slightly longer answer is that it's really difficult, right? Because you can't really quantify what impact is in the first place. It's really tricky. So it's hard to kind of pin it to things. And then secondly, there's a question of whether or not you should use policy citations for that at all. And getting into kind of more like the difference between metrics and indicators. So we would always say, for example, like what the policy citation data is telling you is that there's potentially an interesting story here. And it's robust enough when you're looking at a kind of an institutional level to kind of, or departmental level, to get kind of the direction of travel and to find interesting stories and to compare, benchmark yourself and things like that. But it gets a lot trickier if you start thinking about it in terms of like there's a direct correlation and it's a metric. You know, we're going to measure your policy impact and compare it to other people, especially at an individual researcher level, by just counting your citations. And I don't know if Rich has anything on that around responsible use of altmetrics and metrics more generally. The final thing I was going to add to that is that even within the platform, you know, again, we saw people use a full text search for things, and definitely being mentioned by name is the other big way that we see individual researchers kind of track their policy impact. So if you, in an extreme case, if you're called to give evidence in front of a Senate subcommittee, they're not citing your research, but they do say, you know, we brought in Alice Smith from the University of Minnesota. So we try and track that in Overton. That's a different type of citation we wouldn't kind of include in the normal counts.
Mhm. Great. Rachel, anything to add there?
Yeah, I was thinking of the same paper that Ewan mentioned was the QSS paper that I had looked at, and sort of that correlation between policy citations and the ref policy impact. I think policy impact statements or something like that. I'm not as familiar with the ref because I'm in the US. But that was one of the things I was thinking about. There was also a really good paper from Kim Holmberg and in the what journal is this? Journal of Altmetrics, which they talk about what is societal impact and what does it actually mean. And they also do mention policymakers and policy documents and how to actually frame impact, real world impact. And I think it's just a really interesting paper. And it's not necessarily saying that policy citations are societal impact, but it's looking at things on a more qualitative level. And so it's a little bit different, as Ewan was saying, it's a really difficult thing to quantify. But there's kind of like looking at systems to assess policy impact. So they look at that as well. And so I'll copy that paper into the chat and you can take a look at that. So they've kind of they look at the wider impact of things, and they also kind of look at what some of the research on the ref has said as well, the research excellence framework in the UK. And so I'll go ahead and it talks about the challenges with altmetrics and altmetrics in general, not altmetric the company, but altmetrics in general. So I'll copy that into the chat as well.
Great. Okay, move on to the next question. Let's see. In general, do papers get cited in Overton? In general, do papers get cited more in public policy documents like they do in academic journals? What are the citation patterns? And maybe Ewan, is that a question for you?
Well, I can do a quick answer, and if anyone, hopefully it holds true with what people have seen. So in general, when you zoom out, there's been a couple of external groups that looked at this. So the first thing is that academic papers get far fewer policy citations than they do academic citations, which is kind of makes sense when you think about it. So that citation culture doesn't exist so much in policy. It happens a lot, but not to the same extent as in academia, nor close to the same extent. If you zoom out and you look at all the papers published between, I think it was like 2008 and 2014, that were in Scopus, I think this is the science metrics analysis, they found that I think it was like 4%, somewhere around 4% of them are cited at least once in policy. So that's the headline figure. When you zoom into that, it's incredibly age and subject dependent, which is true in bibliometrics in general, academic bibliometrics, but doubly so in policy. So if you look at development studies or economics, for example, 40% of the papers that they kind of sampled in that time frame end up being cited in policy somewhere. So that's much higher than the average. When you look at something like quantum physics, which is very hard science, it's hardly cited at all, less than 1%. And when you look at things like drama and archaeology, again, under 1%. So there's this big kind of, things that you might expect to get used in policy, and especially the social sciences, get cited a lot. And the humanities, sadly, because they're always a bit of the poor cousin when it comes to citations, and the very hard sciences get cited much less frequently. And that hard sciences, social science thing, I think it was always interesting because in traditional bibliometrics, it's the other way around. The hard sciences get all the citations, and psychology and education and things don't. But in policy, it's the other way around. But yeah, less numbers than in academia, but it depends on the subject.
Great. Okay, let's see. Popular question here is from Nicholas. Is there concern that a growing lack of transparency in the government, specifically in the US, but also elsewhere, and the defunding of federal agencies could potentially lead to the elimination or at least a significant reduction in white papers, gray literature, and other publicly accessible policies? And how concerned should we be?
I would say from a UK perspective, and this may be speaking slightly out of turn, we're really concerned about what's going on in the US at the moment scientifically. And I think it's undoubted that there's going to be an impact.
Yeah, I think there's another question elsewhere as well, talking about the disappearance of government documents. I think so. We have seen that a little bit. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting in the US because at the same time as the things that are going on now, there's also like the Evidence Act and things that got signed in. Actually, in President Trump's first term, he was the one that signed this in, which is about mandating federal agencies to put together research. The research they say what research they need for future policy making and things like that, and to be better about tracking what they use. So there's a bit of a, going in lots of different directions at once. But yeah, we're certainly, we can, see there are things dropping off websites, and it is concerning. I think I'd be more worried about people not citing the research they're using, and about academics not wanting to be cited in policy. If you think about, if you're an academic working on, masking in COVID or vaccines or anything that could be controversial, maybe at this point you're like, I don't want to be cited in policy and for that information to be made public, because it can only do bad things for me and my career, even though it's an area that you feel like you have something to contribute on. So I think the number of documents will still be there. It's just, are the citations showing that evidence link going to be there?
Okay, great. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. There's one here from Ken. Does Overton provide PDFs of policy documents or just links to the websites where they're found? And like you said, Ewan, I'm thinking of recent purges of documents from some US government websites.
Yeah, we're active. So we don't make the PDFs available at the moment, mainly for just licensing reasons. We just need to be really careful about that. What we are doing now is going back and kind of curating, making sure we have the correct license statements for all the PDFs, and the ones that can be made public, even if they've disappeared from the original site, we'll make public. It's just, we need to be very careful about that, obviously, to make sure we're not doing anything we shouldn't.
Right. Okay. I think we can squeeze one more in. Let's see. A question from Barbie. Does Overton rely on publishers/database vendors to identify retracted works, or does it use additional mechanisms to identify policies that might have relied on problematic research publications?
I can answer that really quickly. So we don't, we use cross-reference, does have some retraction data in it, but we don't mark it in the database. But it is an issue. So there's been a couple of academic papers looking at this, which, just like in normal academic papers, policymakers cite retract stuff all the time, including policymakers who you think should know better. They cite the retracted articles after the articles have been retracted, or after there's been a correction published and all sorts of things. So it does happen, but yeah. we don't flag it up in the data.
Got it. Okay, and I think we're right at the hour. So I'll say thanks so much to you and David, Isabel, Rachel, and Yvonne for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you to our attendees for your questions and comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and ACRL with a link to the recording and where to access today's slides. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from the webinar and hope to see you again soon on another session.